nor any eureka moments.
Okay, let me see.
How
The
about-
house that you sold before you moved here, that is right next to Jim and Werner, or?
No, that one we sold in 2006, and we bought the house on Green Street then because our friend Ann Bradbury, I'll talk about her if you want a bit.
Which house on Green Street was yours?
211, 213. It's the third, well, from the counting the corner offices, and then there's a little yellow house, tiny little lovely little boxy house. And then there's a garage, and then there are two twins, who were working class brick buildings from the 1830s, I think, or 40s. And then comes Elio's house, and then comes Zoe and Dale's place. That's just been redone and painted a wonderful, what is that color? Sort of a maroon.
Yeah. Okay, I know it.
Dusky maroon, maybe. It's a brick. It's a double brick house.
Yeah.
Very ordinary with a stoops.
Go on vibrate if you. You on vibrate?
I think I should be. Yeah, I accidentally hit speaker when I was there.
We have the most profound statement in the world, and then your phone, one of our phones rings.
Yeah, it should, yeah. It's, the vibrate makes noise too, though, unfortunately.
France is at the office. Only 3 people. I have 3 people to see down here today. That's Frank Gilmore, and then your friends there at the Shabby Chic.
Oh, you're going there?
Shabby chic.
From them.
Oh, this is Macaquinho. Very large kitty. He's going to examine. He thinks that might be a cat carrier.
I have a very large black cat too, so he probably smells my cat.
I bet he does.
Yeah.
I bet he does.
I have a very little black cat compared to that.
Oh, we have a little black cat
The
too.
size of mine.
The little black cat will come out. He's very much more social than this one. This one is, I'm amazed that he's here. This is a New Orleans street cat. He's a caretaker. He had 2 siblings. They were all dumped on the street, and he saved the other 2 by when he cried, and some friends heard him, and they picked him up, and he continued to cry, so they looked around. There was another little one, and then he continued to cry, and there was his brother across the sidewalk. So he's from Tremé. You know, heard about Tremé? Tremé is probably the oldest African-American community west of the Appalachians. And there's a TV program in HBO called Tremé. It was the follow-on to The File. Did you ever see The File? Yeah. This was the next. Anyway, he's from there.
He's a little hero.
I'm good, I'm rolling.
And the
I
other.
picked mine up in the middle of Rugby Street, so right in the intersection, a little kitten. She was running around, right, doing circles in the middle of the street.
Oh.
Stopped my van picked it up and picked her up and took her home.
Our cat appeared in our backyard and it never
You
left,
did.
so.
Why not? Come on, Macaquinho. Come on, get in the picture.
Okay, we're ready anytime you guys are ready.
Well, here we are.
Here we are, yes.
Shall I go?
Introduce yourself.
Well, yeah, I'm Malcolm Willison. I've lived in the Stockade only since 1984, which is by the Stockade standards yesterday, and sometimes feels like yesterday to me. We tried to live in the Stockade for many years, because I first came to Schenectady in 1964, and but there were never any. At first, my first wife and I were renting, and there were no places, apparently, at least we were never told of any, that we could have lived in with our kids. And we bought a house elsewhere in town, and then we separated and sold that house, and my new wife and I wanted to live in the Stockade too, but again, couldn't find any place to rent. So finally we were ready to buy a house because her mother was coming. So we weren't shown anything in the Stockade, and we asked Werner and Jim, Werner Fibers and Jim Schmidt, friends of ours, whether there was anything in the stockade, and they said, "Oh, sure, there's a house right next door that the divorced wife of the famous city judge who used to drink a lot and get into trouble, Diddy Quinn, was about to sell. She hadn't put it on the market yet, so we rushed in and loved it. I saw it from the street, and it's a huge old Victorian townhouse, really hideous on the outside, with a big bay window, and it dominates all the other houses because it's so big. But we bought it because it was perfect for what we needed. Mother-in-law downstairs and we upstairs. And then that's how we became citizens of the Stockade, and joined the Stockade Association, and sometimes went to the heritage meetings and so forth. And Werner and Jim, of course, had already, and our friend Ann Bradbury, who lived at 213 Green Street, around the corner, had introduced us to some extent to society in people in the Stockade. So we started knowing people. And Werner and Jim were very interesting, of course, people. And they'd lived in the Stockade since the late 50s and bought that house and fixed it up at 17 North Ferry Street, and knew everybody, very social, and they went around. So we began to give parties in this huge Victorian house, and I remember once Lavinia Van Shanklin came, along with another former friend of ours, and we were very explicit, no smoking, because my wife and I were both not asthmatic, but we were allergic to cigarette smoke. And there's the little cat being licked by the big cat, the caretaker. And Lavinia, I came out of the party, and there were Lavinia and Nancy Jonas sitting on the stairs to the upstairs, smoking away. I was furious. I told them to stop, and they didn't, of course, because Lavinia was already in her 70s, probably, or 80s. She wasn't going to stop for anybody. And she used to give parties. I think they were New Year's parties, New Year's Day parties, and we got invited once, maybe once or twice, not very often, while she was still alive. But the one I went to was packed with people. You know, everybody was there, and this was in the old Yates house, which is allegedly the oldest house in the Stockade, though there's some question about another house, but doesn't matter. And you know, and she would be floating through the party with her cigarette, and she was a grande dame. If you ever want a definition of a grande dame, she was a grande dame. And she had a sister-in-law who really was a Van Shanklin. Of course, she was a Van Shanklin by marriage. I have no idea what her maiden name was. I don't know whether she was from old Dutch family or not. But Mary Vanderbogart married a Dutch descendant, obviously, Giles, for whom Werner and Jim first worked when they came to Schenectady to be architects. They became partners of Giles. And Mary was his very plain, solid person, completely unlike Lavinia, and it was clear they did not get along. I was told later they didn't, but anyhow, I knew that from the beginning, just from their personalities. And she was the Van Shanklin, because that was her maiden name. Mary, the one thing I remember specifically, Mary welcomed us to the Stockade, my wife and I, which was very nice of her, in her house. And I remember the one thing she really didn't like, and I forget whether she told us, I think she did, that anyway, the story was that she and Giles wanted to live in the Stockade, and they bought the house, which was, I was trying to remember the other day, 23 Green Street, 23 North Ferry Street, I think. I'm pretty sure that's the number. Anyways, it's the little red house that's sideways to the street. Let's see, 17, 19, 21, 23. 23, 25, 20, yes, it must be 27. Anyway, when we moved into the stockade, it had a huge picture window above the front door, totally inappropriate. And the story was
Joe Fava's house, not-
that
Joe Fava lives there.
Joe Fava lives there now, and he's put back the proper windows, thank goodness. Anyway, the story was that they bought the house, and she went off one day, and maybe on a trip or something, you know, an overnight. And when she came back, there was this huge picture window. And she said, "What did you do to Giles?" And he said, "We needed more sunlight. We needed more light." And she said, "You know, it ruins the house." But she put up with it, and she never changed it, even when he died. I never met Giles. He had died, I think, before we came to Schenectady. And so she never changed it. But anyway, so she was a very person of pronounced opinions. No question about that. We met a lot of these people through Anne Bradbury, who lived at 213 Green Street and owned 211. They were a pair. She and her husband had come from the University of Iowa to Union. He'd been on the faculty there as probably an instructor or an maybe an assistant professor. And they got kicked out for politics because they were too left-wing. And Anne always, Anne always felt she had something in common with me and my parents, even though they didn't quite approve of Anne, because they had all been members of the CP in the 30s, which was interesting. So, but Anne's politics were totally social. She really wasn't interested in politics. I think she joined the Communist Party because it was what people were doing then. She was an airplane. She learned to fly, and she was one of the few women traffic controllers during World War II. I think in Chicago or somewhere, and. So she was a lively kind of person, and then they went off to the university. She married John Bradbury before the war, actually, and he got a degree, and they went to the University of Iowa, which was, of course, a writer's school, and he was in English literature. But then they came to Union, and they joined the cadre of people who had all retired by the time I got to Union in 1964. And I was trying to remember their names. There were the Blodgetts, Harold Blodgett, and there was an historian, I think he was a philosopher. And there was an historian whose name I can't remember. But they're in all the books, you know. They were part of the 1930s cadre of people who did things at Union under Fox, the president then, who was also an historian. And the Bradburys knew all these people, and you know, he had come while they were still there. And they were, the Bradburys were good at the social. They were both from Louisville, Kentucky, so naturally. And Anne had a very strong Southern accent. Louisville being right across from the Ohio, I guess, has to make sure you understand it's Southern, because it's so close to the north. And Anne always said, always implied that she came from among the best families in Louisville, but Werner, who also grew up in Louisville, said, "That's nonsense. I mean, her father was a school principal." Well, anyway, her grandfather, it must have been, so her grandfather? Yeah, her grandfather, or her great-grandfather, I forget, on her side, had been a missionary in Japan in the it was her grandfather, in the 1880s and 90s. And so Anne's mother had been a child in Japan, which was interesting. Her mother was a piano teacher. But Anne had all these, she was a Southern belle, basically. And she talked like one, and she acted like one, you know, she moved her hands around and did nice things and gave dinner parties. And she would cook in the kitchen while everyone was sitting, enjoying themselves. And then she would come out and be the hostess, which is wonderful. We loved it. And she introduced Martha and me. I called her one day to ask for her sister's address in the south of France because my first wife, we were now separated, but had been in correspondence with his sister for, I don't know why, but she was, but had never met her. And my first wife was going to France and traveling through France. And I said, well, you've got Jane Glenn's, that was their maiden name, her address in the south of France. She lives there. No, she hadn't. So I called Anne and said, what's your sister's address? And I'll send it to my first wife, care of American Express in Nice, which was near where they were. And Anne said, oh yeah, sure, here it is. And she said, but you might be interested in meeting someone that I'm going to the theater with, and then we're having dinner at my house. So I got invited to another one of her dinners. It was just a 3-person dinner, and that was Martha. And so that's how we met at Anne's house. So when Anne unhappily had all kinds of ailments. She had too many martinis, unfortunately, but and she she lived a good life, but she had a lot of physical ailments, and she eventually burned herself up. She was cooking breakfast, and she always wore long flowing gowns and things, and the sleeve caught on fire, and she burned herself really badly. When she finished her breakfast, and of course the shock didn't wear off for a while. I mean, the shock which protects you from knowing what's happened. She actually burned some of the tiles in the dining room. So she obviously had gone in from the kitchen into the dining room before she could put it out. So all that spring, they were doing grass and so forth, and we came back from New Orleans, and she was by then, she was in a nursing home, and the grass didn't take, and she died. So Werner was her executor, or whatever right term is. Yeah, he was her executor. He had to sell the house to settle the estate because she had nieces. They had no children, she and John. They had no children. But she had 3 nieces, Jane's daughters, in France. Jane had married, lived with a number of different people, and she had different daughters by different men. Very wonderful people that really, I've met them all, and they're marvelous. Anyway, one of them is a little like Anne, actually, without ever having met Anne, of course. That happens. So we said to Werner, we'll buy it, because we've always loved that house. And this house is now too big. Martha's mother has died, and it's really impractical, this huge house. And we're not giving parties anymore. We're living in New Orleans. So they, and Werner said fine, and he sold it to us for a hefty price, and which we were very happy to pay. And we had to empty the house because he was the executor, but he didn't really want to deal with all the clothes and the furniture and jewelry and all that stuff. So we sorted it out and put aside things we thought the nieces would want, and moved in and lived there for 6 years. While the house slowly fell apart, we discovered, we knew all the things were wrong with it when we bought it, but the romance wore off, which is why we're here in this wonderful place. But anyhow, that house was interesting for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons, which I regret not having done anything about, was that in the cellar, which had a dirt floor, one of its many problems, there was the root of what I think was a cedar tree. It was spread out like that, and I meant to take it over to the Historical Society so you could date this. It's probably from when it was built. It may be one of the trees that was in the field that was there before they built this place in the 1830s, which would have been interesting. Anyway, we also found a lot of things in the backyard at 19 North Ferry Street, because that's part of the old stockade, the original stockade. The Green Street house is outside. It's in where the fields were, and the woods. initially. But in the back of our house, we found little bits of pipes and pottery and things. I don't think the people I sold it to, whom I told about it, I don't think they did anything with it. They probably threw it away. Just too bad. But anyhow, there's all kinds of stuff in the stock. It's kicking around, so I don't know. They probably didn't need them. Someone once said, "Well, really, it's not that important. Don't fret about it." We have lots of old pipes, Dutch pipes, the Dutch pipe things. That's how we met people, through Anne, really, as much as Vernon, much more so than Vernon and Jim, because she gave big parties for everybody, including Lavinia, and I think Mary came to one or two. Mary wasn't very sociable. She scorned that sort of thing, I think. But we met lots of other people that way. And we missed, and still miss Anne quite a bit. And then there's Arthur's Market. Arthur's Market, when we first came in 1964, had been there for a long time. We would sometimes go and shop there, and even before we moved 20 years later I moved into the Stockade. There was no special reason to go there. It was entirely a shop. It was not, there was no place to sit down. You could sit down outside. Eventually Arthur, I think because of his son Peter, who inherited the Arthur's, I think Peter is the one who said, you really ought to put chairs and tables outside, and then people can sit down. And people loved to do that. And they would come, they'd be occupied all the time, all day long, people talking away to each other, coming from not just the Stockade, but all around. And Arthur, I think, kept it going, primarily by selling beer to the guys from the YMCA, who were sent up from New York because they were alcoholics, and had minor infractions of the law, and so they were shipped up to Schenectady to live at the Y. And they would come tootling around and tootle off. And people in the Stockade were, it's so awful. When and it came up as an issue. I'm trying to remember how it came up, because there was a petition. I think basically it must have been to have Arthur stop selling beer, something like that. It would have impacted his business. And of course we refused to sign because we knew how important his business was. It wouldn't be Arthur's without the beer. Well, Arthur died and Peter took over. And Peter, a really smart guy, said, okay, we're going to have people inside sitting down as well as outside. And he moved all the suds and soaps and cereals and everything into one side of the Arthur's, and turned the other side into originally it was a butcher's, but that didn't do very well, so he turned it into a sandwich counter kind of thing, and that went very well, and people came and from all around, from the community college, I suppose, and GE, and eventually MTV moved down into the courthouse for a while. They would come and have lunch, and it thrived. And beer continued to be sold. And Peter is, like Arthur, they were both very social. Peter was a little more laconic, but Arthur was very tactful. Someone said Arthur, he got all the gossip, but he didn't let it all out. You could get things out of him. He would make allusions to things. You could find out something from Arthur if you did it right. And every noon, around noontime it must have been, Maggie would show up. That was Peter's mother and Arthur's wife, a huge woman, wonderful woman. God, she was so smart. She had been going to Vassar, and unfortunately she got Peter instead, which was really too bad for her, and she really resented it. And you could tell, even at 70, she was still mad. But she was a wonderful woman, and she was, up on things. And they lived upstairs, and she would read the New Yorker and everything else, and Harper's, I suspect, and the Atlantic, that kind of thing. And she knew what was going on. around the world, and Arthur knew what was going on around the stockade, so it's perfect. I'm not sure what they talked about between themselves, but anyway, it was perfect. Arthur had originally been across the street because where the law offices are now had also been a market, and he bought that initially, or moved in, I don't know whether he bought it or rented it, but anyway, there'd been a market, there was already a market where Arthur's was, so they were competing opposite each other, and eventually Arthur drove out the other guy, or something happened anyway, and he moved in there, and the other market closed when he gave it up, I guess. It seems to me that was probably in the 40s. And so anyway, so Peter ran Arthur's market for, God, it must have been 10 years maybe. But then he got cancer and he died. And then after that, Artur bought it, Artur Wachala, and tried to run it himself, and then that didn't work, and he rented it to someone who lived down the block a little bit, who ran it as a fine food establishment, which was really good food. But that didn't make it, and then it became, what was something else, experimental. Oh yeah, Richard Genest, who runs the Moon and River, tried it out. He thought, a great place, we'll have poetry readings and lots of music. But that didn't work out. And then so Artur, and then he rented it to these two people from, I think there were two people from Pakistan, I forget. And that didn't work out. And then he rented to these people who had other establishments around the capital region, Lebanese, I suspect. I think they were, and that didn't work out, so now he's going to run it himself again. So we'll see whether that works. He doesn't want to give it up, and it'll become Arthur's again. For a while it was not Arthur's, so it really do that. But he's going to do something interesting. I think he talked about it being primarily a place for people to gather.
Well, but that's kind of what it used to be, right, when you were...
I'm sorry?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what it used to be.
Yeah, which it was under Peter.
Yeah.
I think that's what it should be. So he's quite right. There was something else I was going to talk about. What was it? Peter, This place is interesting. The Riverside School is now a condominium where we're sitting. It was probably built, I don't know exactly when, someone could find out. It's from the architecture, it's obviously, I think it's early 1920s, likely. I wonder what they tore down to put it up. I worries about that kind of thing. But anyway, and what was destroyed in digging, but this was beyond the stockade. So I first came to this building in the 1960s to WMHT. WMHT's original studio was in the basement in 106, I think. I'm not sure about the number, but anyway, in 106. I came for a panel of some kind on the new politics. And then in the 1970s, my first wife had helped set up the open school, and it was also in the basement. Well, WMHT had moved on to bigger and better things, and the basement, that very same room was my first wife's schoolroom in the open school. And then in the 1980s, the open school moved on and then dissipated, which is too bad. And in the 1980s, or probably in the 90s actually, a poetry group, the Washout, sometimes called the Washout Stockade, but it's broader than that. Poetry group that was founded in 1973, is that right? Yeah, 73. Would sometimes meet at Michaela French's, who had been the editor of the Stockade Spy, and then moved on to run the not postgraduate, the Adult Learning Center for Union College, UCAL. And her apartment was also 106, if that's the number. And we would sometimes meet there. We moved around people's houses. And we would meet in Michaelis. So when I was, the day we came to look at this place, I met someone, we introduced someone, and he said, would you like to look at my apartment? And I said, what number is it? And he said, oh, it's 106. I said, no, I don't need to see it. I've been there a number of times. He was impressed, I must admit. Anyhow, the Riverside condo was built in the 80s. I mean, it stopped being a school, a consolidation of primary schools. There weren't enough kids in this area, which tells you something about the shifting demographics. I think there are now a lot more little kids than there used to be when we first moved in. Partly because I think that's what I want to talk about. There's been a population shift again. The stockade when we first came here when I first came to Schenectady, it was recovering. It had been kind of parts of it had been quite run down. Some houses were in bad shape. And Berner and Jim, of course, were instrumental in making this historic district and setting up the Stockade Association and getting the Stockade Spy published and creating a kind of sense of community, essentially a community of homeowners rather than tenants, and there were a lot of tenants in those days. And then the Stockade moved up, and there some really pretty fancy houses, old houses in the Stockade. And then it kind of leveled off, and what's now happening, I think, is interesting because it's clear that there are more African Americans living here, and some of them quite poor. You can tell from the way they comport themselves that they're not well off. And some places seem to be becoming sort of Section 8 housing, and that's always been true of some parts of the Stockade. I'm just more aware of it now, I suppose, because I live more deeply in that section. In Ingersoll, for example, I'm not sure about Ingersoll. Ingersoll is very working class. The nice thing about the Stockade is the enormous mixture of classes, not just ethnicity, the Dutch versus the Episcopalians, the Dutch reformers, Episcopalians, and the rest of us, who are neither. But not to forget the really conservative Presbyterians. I don't know how many of them live here, but not too many, I suspect. Anyway, hi, sweetie. This is Pulinho. This is the little one. Hi, sweetie. Yes, you're a sweetheart. He's from an aristocratic New Orleans family, we suspect. He's too fancy. He was put up for adoption. They couldn't keep him. Couldn't meet his standard of life. So anyway, the mixture has always been quite pronounced. The contrast, of course, is from the Stockade really extends the region all the way over, essentially to the old Alco plant. To Knott Street. But beyond the railroad tracks is on the other side of the tracks. And those people tend not to belong. Not only tend, but don't belong, let's put it that way. There's one person I know, a friend of ours, a pair, who come and do some Stockade Association things. They're the only ones I know of, I'm pretty sure. And another one is, I see socially or politically, because he's left-wing and belongs to an organization, Schenectady Neighbors for Peace, for example, also lives over there. But those are the only people we know there. My daughter lived there when she was on welfare. She was at welfare isn't the right word. She was mentally ill, and she had a stipend. And she lived there for a while at one point. So it gives us, that's my perspective on the other side of the track. And I suspect it's a lot of people's in the Stockade. The Stockade, of course, is being much improved by people like Robin White, who's fixed up a number of places and doing a good job. And Ron Chard, who's just bought the Yates mansion, which he's had his eye on for decades. He's now happy at last. He's not going to have to move on anymore. He's fixing it up. We used to go swimming in that backyard. It was known as what's his name? Anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. There's a swimming pool back there, which Ron says is cost too much to fix to meet standards. But in the old days, everybody who was anybody, including Ann Bradbury, that's how my wife met Ann Bradbury, was swimming at the Harlow's pool. Harlow was a professor of engineering at Union for half a century, I suspect. He's still alive. He's in his late 90s, just thriving. They've just sold it, though, because he's living in Ohio and it's too much trouble. But not because he couldn't. You know, he could run that place from Ohio with the snap of his fingers. He also, his real claim to fame was that he was what do you call it? A breeder, I guess. Not the right word for plants, but anyway, he bred tuberous begonias, and he had a greenhouse. As you walk down Governor's Lane, on the right, you know, there's the building, of course, and then there's a wall, and then there's a garage. There's a set of garages, and next to the garages, uphill from the garages and into the garages, he had a greenhouse, and in it he crossbred begonias, and he apparently was famous in begonia territory for being a big begonia developer. So that's Gil Harlow, and we all call it Harlow's anyway, still, even though Ron now owns it. The other person whom I don't think I ever met, I might have met him at Ann's very early on, was Cohen. What was his name? Al Cohen. Anyway, he was.
Ernie?
Yes, Ernie Cohen. He was very also, along with Vernon and Jim, I think he was instrumental in saving the stockade, because he would buy houses and fix them up. And I think he may have even fixed up Ann's house before she bought it, because it was quite modern. The 213, unlike 211, the twin, is very 1950s. That's the other reason we liked it, because it had a 1950s living room, and Ann had furnished it in 1950s furniture, so we loved that. We got these are from that house, and we saved a few other things of hers, I forget. Anyway, and I'm pretty sure Ernie was the one who fixed it up. He was also a painter, and somewhere, I don't see it here, but we have a little tiny one. We painted a lot, actually, mostly houses, sort of cubistic style house roofs, sort of like this, like out this window, but without any trees. It was very urban. I think it was from New York City, I'm pretty sure, probably from Brooklyn. That rings a bell somehow. Anyway, he was obviously quite a guy, because even if we never met him, we're given a very distinct notion of what he was like, you know, short and dynamic and running around doing things, which was wonderful. But the old families, I mean, he was obviously an outsider. The old families, you know, they just went along their way. They lived in their old houses, and if they fell down, well, okay, that's because they couldn't fix them up. And if they didn't fall down, that's because their sons or somebody had gone out and gotten a decent job and kept it up. Van Shanklin's son, that is to say, Lavinia's son, was, I think, an engineer, something. And he didn't live in her house, because it was her house. But he bought a little house behind the next house up Union Street. I don't know whether you've ever seen it. It's a little funny little square house. It was right next to our yard when we lived at 19 North Ferry Street. And it was right to the left as we looked down out our yard. So it was behind the house, a big, huge Victorian house on Union Street. And he would drive us crazy because we'd sit on our patio, not patio, what do they call them? The thing our porch, we'll call it a porch, anyway, in the late afternoon, and he would come out with his lawnmower and run it up and doing not only his lawn, but Lavinia's too, of course. So when Lavinia died, her granddaughter inherited it, and she had married the guy, and she died of cancer, unhappily, very, not very recently. They had children, but anyway. And her husband isn't interested in old houses. I can hardly blame him, having lived in old houses. It's on the market, and the woman who was teaching the archaeology course I was just in said, we were digging up the railroad, I was telling you earlier, we were digging up the old railroad that ran through the stockade for 4 or 5 years in the 1830s in a trench that, I don't know how they did it, but anyway, they put bridges over Union Street, on Union Street and on State Street, State Street. They had little bridges over this gully that they ran the railroad to for a few years, until they rerouted it, thank goodness, this other way. Anyway, so we were digging that up, and why did I bring that up? I forget. There was a reason, because it's because something you were talking about.
The woman who was teaching your class was...
it was, the woman who was teaching the class said that this son-in-law is not interested in keeping it. It's too much trouble, and his children are too young. They're in their 20s, and they're not interested in houses yet. Just wait. Anyway, so that's that. Can I think of anything else that's interesting about Stockade? Can you think of anything I should talk about?
Well, it's been one thing that you've done really differently than the other people that we've interviewed is you've been talking a lot about the characters and the people that live.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I can think of anybody else who was really... all kinds of people have moved through the stockade. There's probably a huge population of people who have rented houses or rented apartments. I can think of 10 people I know who've lived here at one time or another. So there's this kind of floating population that comes and goes, and the poor people too, likewise. But there are these very steady people, like the Colangelos, who have been here forever. You can imagine how they were treated when they first got here. Italians, 1910, oh my God, they're a different race, and now they're really part of the establishment. She's a major figure in both the Stockade Association, though less so, she's kind of pulling back a little, thank goodness, and in the Nykirk Association, about the Schenectady Nykirk. Nykirk was where Ben Curler, the founder of Schenectady, was born, and they've set up an exchange of adults and of kids. Has anyone else talked about that? That may. I think that's really quite significant because it broadens the perspective of stockaders. There's really an international element to our being here. The Dutch came across an ocean to get here, and the English too, and the Scotch, and let's not forget the Norwegians, and let's not forget the Irish, and then of course the Italians and everybody else. The city is there are Hungarians here, and where else are people from? A lot of Serbo-Croatians, if you can still call them that, since they're fighting each other, Serbs and Croatians, and Slovaks, and all kinds of other people who came, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Considerable Jewish population, I'd say, a significant one anyway, depending on, let's see, I don't think...
The Nykirk.
I'm sorry?
The Nykirk.
Nykirk, as I said, has done a lot. It also ties us in with the New Netherland project in Albany, which I think is important because they're translating the Dutch documents and they're renewing the interest in the history of the early Dutch of Fort Orange and others, which was interesting which interested people in the late 19th century and some early 20th, but there was kind of a gap and an interest, and I think it's reviving that, which is a good thing, because I think it's important that we understand where we come from. It's really interesting to look at old maps of Schenectady and how it grew. Luis Braga, the instructor in this course, archaeology course, had put together a set of these maps, which I'd never seen all in one place, and you can kind of watch the progression of the stockade over 2 centuries anyway, century and a half until it became Schenectady, which I think is really quite interesting. Anything else? The Reformed Church is interesting because, and so is St. George's. I hadn't thought of that. St. George's is interesting too. The Reformed Church is, of course, a Dutch Reformed Church originally, and it's quite surprisingly liberal. It has a justice committee, social justice, I think it's called, something like that, which is unusual for a conservative church. The Presbyterians don't have that, I'm told. I haven't even bothered to look to see, but and they give good concerts and they do historical things. Of course, they celebrate their, what is it, bicentennial? Must be 61, 80, yeah, they've just recently. And then they're important for the Nykirk connection too. And they work, I think, closely with the Historical Society, which is another important institution in the stockade, which in turn makes me think of the Heritage Foundation, which Werner and Jim set up. Werner says it's really Jim who did all of that. He kind of sort of says, well, it's Jim was the driving force for all of this, which is modest of Werner, I would say. It's really too bad Jim is. But you did interview Jim before he died, didn't you? Good. Was he? He was having problems with his memory. He thought.
Before.
It was before that. Okay. We didn't think he really did have problems. I think he was just upset by his physical condition. But anyway, Jim was a wonderful person. Anyway, St. George's, when we got here, had for a long time been under the tender loving care of Father Kirby. And Father Kirby was very high Anglican, and he's the one who restored St. George's to its pristine late 18th, early 19th century condition. And he had a following of devoted ladies who really loved him. And he wore a cassock, and he kept all the finery. He developed rituals for the church and got fine liturgical vestments and candelabra and censers that you could swing and smell up the place. Ours, and good music, very good music. I once went to a Quaker meeting because they were going to have a political talk, and it was so tense that when I was through, it was in a private. I was actually in the YWCA. I thought, I was walking back uptown, and I thought, I'll just stop in at St. George's and get a little music, and it was wonderful, just wonderful. I'm a non-theist, but I do like churches and appreciate what other people do to keep them going. And on the way out, Father Kirby was there at the door, and he saw me, and he took my hand, and he wouldn't let go. Oh, he said, and you are, and I said who I was, and he said, oh, I'm so glad to see you, and what do you do? And I said, well, I teach at Union College. Oh, he was such an entrepreneur, but he was also very high church and very conservative. I mean, socially and every other way. There's a book about him called The Innocent Curate by, and I'm sorry who, I don't remember who it was. It was one of this a group of people that I mentioned that Anne Bradbury knew, the Blodgetts and the other people. Anyway, is really about Father Kirby and his entourage and his his enterprise. He eventually retired, and thank goodness, because the changes in the Episcopal Church would have been appalling to him. He was gay himself, I'm quite sure, but you know, allowing those people into the and women, he would have been shocked at that very idea that would happen. Anyway, when he retired, they had a huge celebration, and I thought, you know, I had discovered in the attic at 19 North Ferry Street, Time magazine's address to Father Kirby. So I knew that he had once lived in 19 North Ferry Street. So I spoke to him at one point, and he said, oh yes, that was, at that time, when I first came, that was the rectory, or at least that's where he was a sub, you know, he wasn't the main priest at that point. And he said, yeah, and I lived there. And so I invited him to a farewell dinner with another friend of mine. I forgot to serve the port, which we afterwards, so I thought that'll really do it. Now, anyway, he came and he looked in the living room and he said, oh yeah, we put that in, meaning the fireplace, which was obviously not Victorian. You could tell, just it was flat and brick, and it was 1950s fireplace. And the bookcases, he put in those bookcases. So he was a very literate guy. And then we dined upstairs. Martha was in Brazil. She's a Brazilianist, so she goes to Brazil a lot. And but that was fun. But he didn't want to retire. It's pretty obvious. And he wanted nothing to do with his house, if he could help it, because it reminded him of his beginnings. He's such a guy. And of course, he set up which they still do. They when is it? Sometime during Easter, after Easter, you have a procession around the block. They go, how do they go? I forget which way they go, but anyway, I think they go down North Ferry and they turn on Union and go up to church and come back down Front Street and back to the church, the peregrination. Other high Episcopals do that too. But it was quite a sight, because we could look out of our house and see it going by, and there was, he would bring in the bishop from Albany, and he wanted to be the bishop. That was the real disappointment in his life. He hoped he would be made bishop, because of course the vestments and all the rest of the ceremony. Oh, he should have been the bishop. I don't know why they didn't choose him. It's just effrontery on their part. I would have voted for him. Even put in a good word. And the incense and the cross, the crozier, and he would be carrying a staff. Maybe that's the crozier. I don't know these things. And he'd be all dressed up, and followed by choir boys and no choir girls, of course. Choir boys, and then the deacons and the presbyters or whatever the devil they have in that church, and then the parishioners. They loved it, and I don't blame them. It was really quite good.
Well, they still do it. It's quite
Yeah, they still do it. They still do it, even though it's much less high church. I mean, the present pastor is married, and he's liberal, at least, whatever that means, but it's still an Anglican church. It's not just an old Episcopal church, for goodness sakes. So anyhow, that's that. Let's see, anybody else that I should think about? Ooh. that's about it. I think that's. I'll undoubtedly think of something. Esprit d'escalier while you're going down, the esprit d'escalator, esprit the elevator. You know, while you're going, I'll think of what I should have mentioned. But anyway, that's about it. I think.
Well, that was fabulous, thank you. Really, a lot of people with the interviews we've done haven't talked about the people. They've talked a lot about buildings and things like that, so it was really great to have that.
Yeah, I'm more interested in people. I'm a sociologist.
Yeah.
I don't like individuals, but I'm interested in large groups of people. That's the usual way. And I am very interested in buildings. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about buildings, but I'm sure everybody else has done a bang-up job on all buildings. My grandfather was an architect, and my father, and my uncle was too, one of my uncles, and my father worked in his father's architecture firm when he was, in his early 20s. So I have a hereditary interest in architecture, but I can't think of anything I can contribute that would be, that no one else would have mentioned already.
Do you have a favorite story about the stockade or anything like that?
Oh, let me think. Nothing leaps to mind. I think I've told you all the stories that I...
Any other incidents from some of those famous dinner parties?
Or what attracted you to the stockade to begin with?
Excuse me, it may have been the architecture. And Werner and Jim lived here, and I knew them, and I knew that they had an interesting life. And there was always something... Did I know other people who lived in the stockade? I didn't know Gil Harlow. I mean, I knew him, his colleague, but I don't think I knew him otherwise. And then, excuse me, and I think Martha wanted to live here partly because of Werner and Jim, and it's an old area. It's pretty, and we don't like suburbs, and most of Skanky is really kind of suburban, and lots of lawns, and we lived in apartments up to that point. So we thought, and we were bringing our mother, so we needed a big house, and here's where the big houses were. This big house, that big house on 19 North Ferry Street. No, I can't think of anything that isn't just a personal anecdote, other than the ones I've already mentioned. Lavinia smoking on the stairs. I was so angry. Oh, and she really didn't care. She really didn't care. That was it. I could snub the other woman, because I knew her, but Lavinia, Lavinia was beyond my touch. I couldn't control her. And in a sense, that sort of sets my take on the stockade, is that there are a lot of people kind of, floating around in their own worlds, and all quite different worlds, actually. It has, I think also it has a very slight bohemian tinge to it. That's why we like Key West, because it's very bohemian. And more and more upper bohemian, of course, but what else? Cohen was a painter, and so was the guy who lived in what used to be the violently turquoise house. What's his name? Began with B. Anyway, he was a really good. Anyway, he was very good. He did sketches of animals and things. Has anyone talked about painters here? What was his name? Well, anyway, he was an interesting, but I didn't know him very well, but he was an interesting person. And of course, the musicians. Elio, who lived next door to us, would play his recorder. We could hear him when we lived at Ann's house at 213 Green Street practicing. And there's another musician also there who would practice. He would practice on, what was it he had? He had an Australian, whatever those big long things are called, and he would practice that. So that was nice, we liked that. And I don't think there's anybody else I can think of. But, you know, the chef who tried to run our tours as a fine food place, as an artist too, and let's see, other people, poets live here, have lived here off and on. I'm still trying to remember the name of the painter. He was good. He was well known in the region. And he taught art at, I think, the high school, at Linton, when it was Linton High School. Let's see, who else? Have you talked, I was wondering if you talked to John and Jane. Not Jane, John.
Jean?
I'm sorry?
Jean Zager?
Jean, yeah. You have talked to her?
Yes.
Yeah, good, because one of her sons is also an artist, I think.
Yeah, she has quite a lot of artwork in her house.
I'm sorry?
She has a lot of artwork in her house.
Yeah, she's an interesting person in her own right. And she's lived here for quite a while, actually. She and we were parents of pre-kindergarten children together when we lived in elsewhere. But we would bring, must have been Judith, was it Judith or Andrea? Anyway, down to the preschool. So I've known her for a long time as a fellow parent and then member of the Stockade Association. And she was a friend of Ann's too. Anybody else? It's too bad that Susan is gone, Susan Staffa. And there was someone who lived for a while in the, what was their name? There was an ex-ALCO official whose daughter, who lived in the Stockade, and at the foot of Washington Avenue, and his daughter eventually ended up, or not quite at the foot, next to the last house, which was the grandmother of the, what's his name? Who's now at the foot of Governor's Lane. But anyway, she lived there, and it's too bad she's gone because she had grown up in the Stockade because her parents lived there. It doesn't matter that I can't remember her name because it wouldn't do you any good anyway. Harrison, Connie Harrison, and her father had been, you know, something with ALCO. And further up the street lived the sister of the sculptor. He's called a sculptor, but he's actually, he makes mobiles. Werner and Jim have one of his in their back dining room. Did you interview them at the house? If you looked out the dining room doors,
In the yard?
yeah, the big open in the left side, in a little area they otherwise don't use. There's a sculptor, and what the devil is his name? Martha will remember. Whoops, I'm participating with it. Good, you don't need to hear me talking to Martha. Martha, what's the name of the sculptor?
I have things on my ears. What is it?
What's the name of the sculptor that Werner and Jim have?
George Ricky.
Ricky.
And don't bother me, please.
George Ricky's sister.
All right, well, don't talk now, we're gonna put your mic back
Yeah,
on
okay,
if
I'll
you're gonna go.
Sorry,
That's okay.
forgot all about it.
They flip, it
I'll
comes
sit
up. Let's see, where did I
quietly.
have it? How does I have this? I don't like it like this. There we go. That's the only downside. I like putting it on the floor, but it is the downside because it was attached to your belt and went with you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, George Rickey is quite famous in sculpting circles. He's dead. He died recently. And Werner and Jim designed that place for him. That's why they have this piece of his, which is quite iconic. And there are a lot of those run similar. They're octagonal. In this case, well, mostly two, and they rotate and they turn around in the wind. I think that's one they have. No, I'm sorry, that's not the one they have. Huh, that's interesting. Anyway, this is again the arts connection. He's his estate is worth millions, and he had a studio and a house over in Columbia County. And Werner and Jim, he asked Werner and Jim to design a house for him, which he never lived in, it turned out. And he gave them this sculpture. Actually, it's a double spear-like thing that rotates. And his sister, why did his sister, he didn't grow up in Schenectady, I don't think, but his sister came to live here. I think he grew up in Scotland. His father was an American consul in Glasgow or something. I may have that all wrong, but anyway, Werner knows. But his sister came back here, I think it's because her mother, yeah, that's the connection. Her mother was from Schenectady. And so when his sister, I don't know, divorced, or I think her husband died actually, she came back and lived on Washington Avenue for the rest of her life until, you know, the last 10 or 15 years. And she, I don't think she was an artist, but she had that connection with the arts. So there's another one. A very good poet lived at the corner of Washington and Front Street. He taught at Union. He presented himself as an African American. He wasn't, by any, you know, any interpretation of what you mean by African American. He wasn't, but he took on Afro-American style and wrote African American poetry. And so he was hired as an to teach African American as an African American poet. His wife was in fact more, I think, more completely African American. He went on to somewhere in the South, some good university. I haven't heard of him since he left, so maybe he's not as famous as he should be. But anyhow, that's one poet. And Rob Faber, who teaches poetry at the Adirondack Community College, is that the one up in Glens Falls? He rented an apartment in Ilios, I think it must have been, yeah, in the 80s. Yeah, right after we moved, in the late 80s. He's a good poet. And of course, Michaela wrote poetry. Somewhat Victorian, but not, some of it quite really impressive. It's too bad she's not alive. It would be interesting to interview. And you've interviewed Sylvie, I think you told me, didn't you? Sylvie Breiber.
We haven't interviewed her, but she's also been helpful, suggesting.
Okay, yeah, she, because as the editor of The Spy, she hears a lot, more than I bet she puts in. But Michaela, Werner hated Michaela's version of The Spy. And I defended it, and he said, "Oh, Malcolm, you know, you're so tolerant." He said, "It's just because you're such a snob, you don't think anybody, you don't have to worry. So you don't have to put anybody down." He said, "But I think Michaela's editing is awful," he said. And I defended her. It wasn't as good as Sylvie's. Sylvie's really top-notch, I must say. I'm impressed. But, and she publishes poetry sometimes, in case you didn't know. Yeah, there's poetry, some of mine, in the 80s and early 90s, I guess. I haven't sent things in more recently. Oh, she didn't publish the last thing I sent. Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm boycotting her. I don't think so, no. If I have, If I am, I've just forgotten about it. And there are other people around. I'm trying to think of Jennifer Wells is a poet, which I didn't realize until she came to see us in Key West, and we were having a poetry get-together there, and she was in town just for a day or two, and I said, well, if you don't mind. Well, she said, I write poetry. I'll bring some poems. So they were good. There's someone else who sometimes has in the past. There were poetry readings at Arthur's when it was taken over by Peter. They would be, I think, once a month. Someone, I don't know who set it up. It was really interesting. That lasted for maybe 2 years or so. And of course, once in a while, Moon and River has poetry. That Richard said that wasn't so successful. I guess it didn't draw as many people. So he stopped doing it on a regular basis. But if I pushed him, he'd do it for us anyhow, which is nice, which gives you kind of a flavor of things. And there are a lot of writers who live here. Jackie Craven is trying to write. She lives here. She's moved in, oh, she doesn't live here, I'm sorry, she rents it out, but she owns a place in the Riverside, and she's gone back to writing poetry. She was a member of Washout for 2 or 3 years, and then she said, oh, I'm going to write children's stories, and then she went off and did all kinds of other things, and has now come back to poetry. So she's starting to come to the Washout again. Anybody else from the Stockade? I can't think of anybody else who lives here. And I'm sure there were others kicking around. Yeah, actually, the the guy who lives on the wrong side of the tracks, what is his name? I can't remember. Wrote poetry for a while, and so did Arthur's daughter, Artur. I don't mean Arthur. Arthur's daughter, who committed suicide, which is tragic. But she was a good poet. And she would come to the Washout, some of the Washout meetings too. she had a tree.
In the park with her name?
I'm sorry?
Is there a plaque in the park with her?
Yes, I was just going to say it's been stolen. As far as I know, I haven't seen it. Have you seen it? There's still a little, you can see where the plaque was, but someone pried it off. Awful thing to do. But anyway. But that's her tree. She must have died about 20 years ago, maybe. Is this, yeah, 93. I think that was about it. The time. Let's see. Anybody who else was in that? There's sort of generations of Washout. You know, I try to remember who. There was somebody else. Local, who, anyway, who's not around now.
What's Washout?
Well, it's just this group of poets. It's named Washout because one of the, it wasn't originally called that. It was the outgrowth of a poetry seminar that a bunch of people, all women, took with, I think, Alice Fulton, who's a poet, a good poet. Pretty sure. And they decided to stay together, so they continued to meet. This is starting in 1973. They would meet twice a month, which is quite a lot, and bring poems and critique them. And it's unusual. Most people don't like. Most poets I've met don't like to have their poems critiqued. You know, criticism. I can't bear that. And you're going to change my unique perspective. Oh, I don't know why. But anyhow, I find it very useful because you find out what other people see, and there are things you haven't noticed, mistakes you've made, and also themes that are there but you didn't pick up on. You know, they're there, but you didn't quite see it. You didn't realize you were doing that, and that's, I think, really useful. And also how people take the poem generally. I mean, do they understand it? Does it mean anything? Is it empowering? Is it? Do they find it interesting, etc.? So anyway, so that's what this group was about. And then they decided to put out a journal. And the woman in the group who was going to publish it, who knew typesetting and all that stuff, and had a typesetting business, either then or later. But anyway, knew what she was doing. Said, "Oh, okay, I'll be the publisher, and one of you other people can be the editor." They rotated it. Never asked me, which was quite. I was hurt, but anyhow. And she said, "My grandparents lived on Washout Road. There's a Washout Road up in across the river, and then almost to Hamilton, Hamilton County. It runs up from the river up to the heights, and they had a farm. Her grandparents had a farm on Washout Road. So she said, I'm going to call it Washout Review," which is kind of a funny name for a review. But anyway, so the group gradually sort of took on that name, even though they stopped publishing the Washout after 5 years or so, and started publishing Mildred, and then Mildred, they got tired of Mildred and stopped publishing. But anyhow, so it's called the Washout, sometimes Stockade because we often meet in the Stockade, but not always. And because some of our members, let's see, me anyhow, live in the Stockade. And we've started, since I've come back from New Orleans, I can be a little more present, thank goodness, for their meetings. They only meet once a month now. Anything else about the Stockade? Probably enough. The other thing I like about the Stockade is the architecture. You know, it's varied enough that it's interesting. Mostly 19th century, really. There's not a lot of the old Stockade, but the Teller House and the Yates and the one on Church Street is enough to give the flavor. Everything else is interesting and close enough, I guess, after all. Werner and Jim's is quite old too, actually. Yeah, the front part even. In the back, the living room is an old, I just saw it on the map, what is it? A blacksmith shop, I think. It was, in the 18th century. So those beams are pretty old. The front part, I know. Those columns are totally wrong, you understand. The columns they have in front, it's just too much. But beautiful, It's their way of being over the top without being too obvious about it. It's really so, and for being preservationists, they did preserve the columns. They saved it from another building, of course. That's good. Here are the kiddies. They really want to be in the picture. I can see. Anyhow, if I think of anything else, I'll call you up. And whatever.
So, say your name and spell it again to the camera, just so we have it as a recorded record.
My name?
Yes.
Yeah, Malcolm, M-A-L-C-O-L-M, Willison, W-I-L-L-I-S-O-N. And this is one...
Written material tends to disappear, but this will always be...
I'm sorry, say that again? I'm deaf.
The written material tends to get separated from the media material. But once you have that on the media, then it would always be able to spell it. You know,
Okay, oh, that's